Men are told to be strong, to endure, to stay silent. So when a man is abused, the world doesn't ask what happened to him. It asks, what did he do to deserve it? And that question is exactly why this topic makes people uncomfortable. Because today we're not talking about women as victims, we're talking about women as abusers. And the silence around this issue is destroying more men than anyone wants to admit. Stay with me because this conversation will challenge everything you've been taught. Emotional abuse is not gender exclusive, yet society continues to treat it as if pain has a preferred victim and accountability has a preferred offender. We have been conditioned to associate abuse with physical dominance, raised voices, and visible bruises, which makes emotional abuse far easier to dismiss, especially when the person experiencing it does not fit the expected narrative of vulnerability. Emotional abuse operates quietly. It chips away at confidence through sarcasm disguised as jokes, control disguised as concern, and criticism disguised as honesty. Because it leaves no marks, it is often invalidated. And because men are culturally positioned as emotionally resilient, their suffering is often ignored altogether. When emotional abuse is inflicted by women, it becomes even harder to acknowledge, not because it is less damaging, but because it contradicts the social script. Men are expected to absorb emotional pressure without complaint, to remain stable while being destabilized, and to interpret cruelty as emotional expression rather than manipulation. Constant belittling, comparison to other men, weaponized tears, withdrawal of affection, and subtle humiliation are framed as relationship dynamics rather than abusive patterns. Over time, this erodes a man's sense of worth, making him question his perceptions, suppress his reactions, and accept disrespect as normal. The danger of emotional abuse lies in its gradual nature. It does not arrive as a single traumatic event, but as a slow recalibration of reality. The victim begins to doubt their judgment, second guess their emotions, and feel responsible for the abuser's behavior. When a man is repeatedly told that he is insensitive, inadequate, or emotionally defective, he may internalize the idea that the abuse is a consequence of his failure rather than someone else's dysfunction. This internalization is reinforced by a culture that mocks male vulnerability while rewarding emotional volatility when it comes from women. Another critical aspect is the imbalance of social sympathy. Emotional abuse thrives where accountability is absent. When one gender is automatically believed and the other is automatically questioned, abusive behavior can hide behind victimhood. Emotional manipulation becomes easier when the abuser knows that expressing distress will immediately shift blame and silence confrontation. This dynamic is not about women as a group. It is about individuals who exploit cultural bias to gain emotional control, knowing the system will protect their narrative. Men often remain in emotionally abusive relationships longer because leaving requires admitting pain, and admitting pain invites ridicule. Loyalty, hope, and the desire to fix what feels broken keep them invested, even as their emotional health deteriorates. They are told to be patient, to understand her emotions, to communicate better, while no one asks how much damage constant invalidation causes over time. Emotional abuse does not discriminate by gender. It discriminates by silence, by the absence of boundaries, and by the unwillingness of society to recognize that cruelty can exist without physical force, that manipulation can coexist with vulnerability, and that emotional harm is real even when the victim does not look like one. Power imbalance, not strength, drives abuse. Yet this distinction is rarely understood because power is often mistaken for physical dominance or social authority. In reality, power in relationships is far more subtle and far more dangerous when it operates invisibly. It shows up in who controls emotional safety, who defines reality, who is allowed to express pain, and who is punished for doing so. Abuse begins when one person gains leverage over another's sense of worth, belonging, or stability and uses that leverage to dominate rather than connect. Strength does not require control, but insecurity does, and it is insecurity that feeds on imbalance. In emotionally abusive dynamics, power is created when one person becomes the emotional gatekeeper. They decide when affection is given and when it is withdrawn, when communication is rewarded and when silence is used as punishment. This imbalance conditions the other person to constantly self-monitor, to anticipate moods, and to suppress needs in order to preserve peace. Over time, the abused partner becomes emotionally dependent, not because they are weak, but because the relationship has trained them to equate compliance with safety. The abuser does not need to raise their voice when they can destabilize someone with a look, a pause, or calculated indifference. What makes power imbalance so effective is its ability to masquerade as love. Control is framed as care, jealousy is framed as passion, and criticism is framed as honesty. The person on the receiving end begins to question their own perceptions, especially when every attempt to address the issue is met with denial, deflection, or emotional escalation. Power grows when accountability disappears, when one person's emotions are treated as facts and the others are treated as inconveniences. In such an environment, abuse becomes normalized, not because it is harmless, but because resistance feels futile. Social dynamics often reinforce these imbalances. When one partner is granted automatic moral credibility by cultural narratives, power tilts in their favor before the relationship even begins. If one person knows they will be believed, defended, or excused regardless of behavior, they gain psychological dominance. The other partner learns that speaking up risks public humiliation, disbelief, or reversal of blame. This asymmetry creates a silent hierarchy where one voice matters more, one pain counts more, and one narrative prevails. Abuse thrives in systems where power is protected rather than questioned. The most damaging consequence of power imbalance is the erosion of autonomy. The abused individual slowly loses the ability to trust their own judgment, to assert boundaries, or to imagine leaving without catastrophic consequences. They are not overpowered by strength, but cornered by fear, obligation, and emotional dependency. Power imbalance strips a person of choice while convincing them that they still have it, making the abuse harder to identify and even harder to escape. Abuse persists not because the abuser is strong, but because the imbalance remains unchallenged, allowing control to replace mutual respect and fear to replace connection. Society rewards female victimhood and dismisses male pain in ways so deeply ingrained that most people no longer recognize them as biases, but as moral truths. From an early age, women are socialized to express vulnerability and are met with protection, sympathy, and validation when they do, while men are taught to suppress pain and are met with suspicion or ridicule when they fail to do so. This conditioning does not merely shape emotional behavior, it determines whose suffering is seen as real and whose is treated as irrelevant. When a woman expresses distress, the default response is belief. When a man does the same, the default response is interrogation. This asymmetry creates a social environment where pain is not evaluated on its severity, but on the gender of the person expressing it. Male pain is often reframed as weakness, incompetence, or moral failure rather than injury. A man who speaks about emotional harm is accused of exaggeration, emotional immaturity, or hidden wrongdoing. He is asked what he did wrong, how he provoked it, why he did not leave sooner, or why he cannot handle it. These questions are rarely posed to women with the same intensity. As a result, men learn that vulnerability carries social penalties, while silence offers conditional acceptance. This silence does not indicate the absence of pain, but the presence of fear, fear of being mocked, disbelieved, or stripped of dignity for acknowledging suffering. At the same time, female victimhood is often granted automatic legitimacy, even when the situation is complex or mutual. Cultural narratives frequently frame women as default victims and men as default aggressors, leaving little room for nuance or accountability. This does not mean women do not suffer real harm. Many do. But when victimhood becomes a protected status rather than a context specific reality, it can be exploited. Emotional manipulation, verbal cruelty, and psychological control are excused as trauma responses or emotional expression, while the impact on men is minimized or ignored. Sympathy becomes selective, and accountability becomes optional. This imbalance creates a dangerous feedback loop. Women who adopt victimhood as identity gain social power, moral authority, and immunity from criticism, while men who experience harm lose credibility the moment they speak. Institutions, media, and even personal relationships reinforce this pattern by amplifying female distress and muting male suffering. Over time, male pain becomes invisible not because it is rare, but because acknowledging it disrupts the narrative structure that society has grown comfortable with. The result is not equality, but distortion, where compassion is unevenly distributed, responsibility is unevenly assigned, and emotional truth is filtered through ideology rather than reality. Unresolved trauma and insecurity often sit at the core of emotionally abusive behavior, not as justifications, but as explanations for patterns that repeat themselves across relationships. When emotional wounds are ignored rather than processed, they do not disappear. They seek expression through control, defensiveness, and emotional volatility. Trauma that is unexamined turns inward first, shaping distorted beliefs about safety, trust, and self-worth, and then turns outward, projecting those fears onto others. In intimate relationships, this projection becomes especially potent because closeness activates the very vulnerabilities that trauma has left unresolved. Insecurity born from past hurt creates a constant fear of abandonment, inadequacy, or betrayal. Instead of addressing these fears internally, some individuals attempt to manage them externally by controlling their partner's behavior, emotions, and choices. What appears as jealousy, excessive monitoring, or emotional dependence is often an attempt to regulate inner chaos through outer dominance. The partner becomes responsible not only for their own actions, but also for soothing wounds they did not create. This dynamic slowly shifts the relationship from mutual support to emotional servitude, where one person's stability depends entirely on the compliance of the other. Trauma also distorts perception. Neutral actions are interpreted as threats, independence is seen as rejection, and boundaries are experienced as abandonment. In this state, emotional reactions escalate quickly and disproportionately, often followed by denial or justification. Tears, anger, withdrawal, or accusations become tools of emotional leverage rather than expressions of genuine communication. The traumatized individual may genuinely feel victimized even while inflicting harm because their internal reality is governed by past pain rather than present circumstances. This makes accountability difficult, as acknowledging harm would require confronting wounds they have spent years avoiding. In relationships where trauma remains unresolved, insecurity often masquerades as intimacy. Constant reassurance is demanded but never satisfies because reassurance cannot heal what self-awareness has not addressed. Criticism becomes a way to regain superiority, and emotional instability becomes a means of keeping the partner close through fear rather than trust. The more the partner adapts to avoid conflict, the more power the insecure individual gains. reinforcing the belief that control equals safety. This cycle continues not because the trauma victim is malicious, but because unhealed pain resists stillness and seeks dominance over uncertainty. Without intervention, unresolved trauma hardens into identity. Emotional reactions become personality traits, and insecurity becomes entitlement. The individual begins to believe their pain grants them permission to wound others, that their suffering justifies emotional excess, and that being understood means never being challenged. Relationships deteriorate under this weight as empathy flows in one direction and exhaustion builds in the other. Trauma that is not healed does not remain personal. It becomes relational, shaping dynamics through fear, manipulation, and emotional imbalance, leaving damage that extends far beyond the original wound. Men tolerate abuse longer, not because they fail to recognize it, but because they are conditioned to reinterpret it as something else. From an early age, men are taught that endurance is strength and that emotional discomfort is a test of character rather than a signal of harm. When faced with disrespect, manipulation, or constant emotional pressure, many men do not label the experience as abuse. They frame it as a challenge to overcome, a misunderstanding to resolve, or a personal shortcoming to fix. This reframing delays recognition and allows harmful dynamics to deepen before they are ever named. Loyalty plays a significant role in this tolerance. Men are often socialized to value commitment over comfort, to stay and repair rather than leave and protect themselves. When a relationship becomes emotionally abusive, this loyalty transforms into self-sacrifice. Men hold onto early memories of affection and potential, believing that patience will restore what once existed. They endure emotional volatility, criticism, and humiliation under the assumption that love requires endurance and that leaving would signal failure rather than self-respect. This belief is reinforced by cultural narratives that praise men for staying silent and stoic in the face of adversity. Shame also acts as a powerful restraint. Admitting abuse requires admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability in men is frequently met with disbelief or ridicule. A man who speaks about being emotionally harmed risks being seen as weak, unmasculine, or exaggerative. He may fear that his pain will not be taken seriously, that he will be blamed for provoking the behavior, or that he will be dismissed outright. To avoid this social punishment, many men choose silence, convincing themselves that tolerating the abuse is preferable to facing public invalidation. Another reason men remain in abusive dynamics is hope rooted in responsibility. Men are taught to fix problems, not escape them. When conflict escalates into emotional abuse, they often assume responsibility for de-escalation, believing that better communication, greater patience, or emotional restraint will eventually stabilize the relationship. This sense of responsibility keeps them engaged even as the cost to their mental health increases. Each compromise becomes a deeper investment, making the idea of leaving feel like abandoning both the relationship and their role within it. Over time, prolonged exposure to abuse reshapes a man's internal landscape. Confidence erodes, self-doubt increases, and boundaries weaken. The longer the abuse continues, the harder it becomes to imagine life outside it, especially when the relationship has become intertwined with identity and routine. Men tolerate abuse longer, not because they lack awareness or strength, but because cultural conditioning, emotional investment, and fear of social consequences create a trap where endurance feels safer than escape and silence feels safer than truth. Abuse continues when accountability is replaced with excuses because harm cannot end where it is never acknowledged. Accountability requires confrontation with reality, and excuses exist precisely to avoid that confrontation. When abusive behavior is justified through explanations rather than examined through responsibility, it becomes normalized. Emotional cruelty is reframed as stress, manipulation is reframed as insecurity, and control is reframed as care. Each excuse softens the perception of harm while strengthening the behavior itself. Over time, the focus shifts away from the damage being done and toward protecting the abuser's self-image. Excuses thrive in environments where intent is prioritized over impact. When someone is allowed to say, "I didn't mean it," as a substitute for "I caused harm," accountability dissolves. The person on the receiving end is then pressured to be understanding, forgiving, and patient, regardless of how deeply they are affected. This places the burden of emotional regulation on the victim while granting the abuser freedom from consequence. Abuse becomes cyclical because there is no cost attached to repetition, only explanations that reset the moral scale back to neutral. Cultural narratives often reinforce this pattern by providing ready-made justifications for harmful behavior. Trauma, stress, emotional sensitivity, or past suffering are invoked not as factors to address, but as shields against responsibility. While these factors may explain why someone behaves a certain way, they do not excuse the continuation of harm. When explanation replaces accountability, growth is stalled. The individual is never required to change, only to be understood. And understanding becomes a demand rather than a mutual process. In relationships, excuses are especially dangerous because they exploit empathy. The abused partner is encouraged to see the abuser's pain as more important than their own, to minimize their suffering in the name of compassion. Over time, this erodes boundaries and distorts moral judgment. The victim begins to question whether expecting respect is unreasonable, whether holding someone accountable is cruel, whether enduring harm is a form of love. Abuse persists not through overt force, but through emotional confusion cultivated by repeated justification. Accountability threatens abusive dynamics because it introduces consequence. It requires acknowledgement of harm, willingness to change, and acceptance of discomfort. Excuses remove all three. They allow behavior to repeat without reflection and enable the abuser to remain emotionally comfortable while others bear the cost. Without accountability, apologies lose meaning, promises lose weight, and patterns become permanent. The relationship becomes a space where harm is explained endlessly but never resolved, where language is used to soften reality rather than confront it. As long as excuses are rewarded with forgiveness, sympathy, or silence, abuse has no incentive to stop. It adapts, evolves, and justifies itself more convincingly each time. Accountability is the point where behavior meets consequence, and when that point is removed, abuse is no longer interrupted, only rebranded as misunderstanding, emotional complexity, or unavoidable circumstance. This entire conversation points to one uncomfortable truth. Abuse survives not because it is rare, misunderstood, or accidental, but because it is allowed to hide behind silence, bias, and misplaced compassion. When emotional harm is filtered through gender expectations, power dynamics, unresolved trauma, endurance myths, and endless excuses, accountability disappears and damage becomes routine. Abuse is not sustained by strength or love, but by narratives that protect behavior instead of confronting it. Until pain is judged by its impact rather than its source, until responsibility outweighs explanation, and until silence is no longer mistaken for resilience, these patterns will continue to repeat, quietly, convincingly, and destructively inside relationships that are mistaken for normal while they slowly erode the people inside them.